For Fyodor, the world consisted of predictable cycles. The tide followed the ebb, day followed night, and a full pot became empty. His universe was confined to a strip of rocky shore, an old boat reeking of fish and salt, and a tiny shack where every nail and every board knew its place. In this world there was no room for randomness. He mended his nets not merely until they were strong, but until the mesh achieved perfect symmetry. He sharpened his knives until the blades sang under his fingers. He gutted fish with a single, precise, unerring motion, a cut that was not an act of violence, but one of bringing chaotic flesh to the strict geometry of a fillet. This was his religion, his silent dialogue with the world. He took the sea's wild, untamed life and transformed it into order. The only exception, the sole living deviation from this sterile canon, was Jack, an old dog with mismatched ears and eyes clouded with loyalty. Jack introduced a controlled chaos into Fyodor's life, scattering wood chips by the door, barking at seagulls, sometimes stealing dried fish from the table. Fyodor accepted this as an inevitable margin of error, a constant to be factored into his calculations. He loved the dog with the same silent, demanding affection he held for his perfectly sharpened tools. Jack was alive, and in that lay both his value and his principal flaw. Everything changed on one of those moonless November nights, when the wind roared so fiercely it seemed as if the sky itself was trying to rip the thin film of existence from the earth. The storm washed something ashore that belonged neither to the sea nor the land. At first, Fyodor, who had gone out to secure his boat, saw only a dark silhouette tangled in seaweed at the water's edge. As he approached, he realized it was a person, or what had once been one. The body was unnaturally pale, bloated, but not from water. It seemed distended from within by some putrid emptiness. But the horror wasn't there. The horror lay in the asymmetry of its wounds. They weren't ragged, as if from rocks, but precise, almost surgical, yet arranged in a monstrously incorrect order. The creature's eyes were open, and in them was neither death nor life, only a cold, mocking awareness of a fundamental error in creation. Fyodor gazed at this ghoul, this embodiment of entropy, and for the first time in his life, felt not fear, but revulsion of cosmic proportions. It was an insult, a personal affront to his belief in order. He didn't cry out, he didn't run. He stood in the roaring wind, and something within him, dormant for decades beneath layers of routine, cracked. The ancient, cold fury of a perfectionist confronted with absolute imperfection. At that moment he didn't know that this encounter hadn't infected him with external evil, but had merely given him the key to his own, far more terrible prison. He returned to the shack, sat at the table, and looked at his hands. They were no longer the hands of a fisherman. They had become tools. The first thing his fingers touched was an old wooden spoon lying on the table. He didn't squeeze it, didn't try to break it. He simply covered it with his palm, and a faint hum passed beneath his skin, as if an invisible string was being tuned. He felt the wood not as a solid object, but as a score full of false notes, microcracks, random grain bends, wear from hundreds of meals. And his will, cold and sharp as a scalpel, moved across this score, erasing the superfluous. The spoon transformed under his hand. It didn't become new, it became impossible. Its curve acquired the purity of a mathematical curve, its surface became atomically smooth, and the grain pattern aligned into flawless, perfectly parallel lines. It ceased to be a spoon holding the warmth of his hands. It became the absolute idea of a spoon. Fyodor withdrew his hand and gazed at the object for a long time. In his chest, instead of horror or surprise, a wave of dull, all-consuming satisfaction rose. It was the feeling of a surgeon who had perfectly completed an operation. He stood up and slowly walked through the shack. His touches were now acts of creation in reverse, acts of merciless editing. A knot on the doorframe, which had always irritated him with its asymmetry, retracted into the board, vanishing and leaving behind only the flawless texture of the wood. The gaps between the floorboards closed, merging into a single, monolithic floor, smooth and cold as ice. The glass in the window lost its tiny, invisible air bubbles, transforming into a perfect lens that distorted light with its very correctness. Jack, who had been dozing by the stove, whimpered. He got up, shuffling uncertainly on the new floor, and cowered under an old mat, the only object his master's hand had not yet touched. In his canine mind, there was no concept of order, but he felt life draining from the shack. The air became still, sterile. The floorboards stopped creaking, the wind's hum and the cracks ceased, because there were no more cracks. Fyodor noticed this, but regarded the dog's reaction as another system error that needed correction. He went outside. The world appeared before him as a giant, sloppily executed blueprint. The crooked lines of boulders, the chaotic scattering of pebbles, the irrational bends of old pine roots, all were errors, flaws demanding immediate intervention. He knelt at the water's edge, scooped up a handful of wet sand, and clenched his fist. When he opened it, billions of identical, perfectly formed grains of sand lay in his palm. Dawn bathed the shore in cold light, and Fyodor for the first time saw the world as it should have been. Not created, but calculated. And this calculation was beautiful. His gaze swept over the perfect geometry of the shore and returned to the sole source of dissonance, the shack, from which came a broken, arrhythmic whimper. Jack. The last bastion of imperfection. Fyodor moved towards him, each step on the new, monolithic floor as silent as a thought. He entered the sterile space of the house, and his gaze fell upon the dog, cowering under the mat. Now Fyodor saw not a friend, but a sum of errors. The asymmetry of mismatched ears, the uneven, faltering breath, the chaotic twitching of the tail, the murky, irrational gleam of loyalty in its eyes. This love was a biological anomaly, a program glitch that generated anxiety and disorder. It was the most blatant error in his world. He knelt before the dog. Jack fell silent, pressed to the floor, his whole body a single tremor. He didn't growl, didn't try to run. Animalistic terror paralyzed him. He looked not at his master, but at the void that had assumed his master's form. Fyodor extended his hand and placed his palm on the dog's head. He wasn't petting, he was calibrating. His will, cold and precise as a laser beam, entered the trembling body. It didn't heal, it aligned. First, the trembling ceased, replaced by absolute stillness. Then the fur on its scruff, each hair individually, aligned in a perfect, uniform direction, losing its living texture and becoming a smooth, homogeneous surface. The dog's ears, slowly, with a barely perceptible crunch of cartilage, changed their position, becoming perfectly symmetrical. Its heartbeat, previously the chaotic thrum of living panic, slowed and transformed into the beat of a flawless metronome, 1 beat per second without the slightest deviation. Finally, his will touched its mind. It erased memories of chasing seagulls, of the taste of stolen fish, of the warmth of its master's hand, all that archive of random, meaningless data. It left only basic commands: sit, lie down, breathe. Fyodor withdrew his hand. Jack became perfect. And dead. Not in the sense that he stopped breathing, his chest rose and fell with mathematical precision. He was dead because he ceased to be. He rose, not impulsively as he had thousands of times, but with the smooth, calibrated grace of a mechanism. He sat at Fyodor's feet, his posture the epitome of canine obedience. His eyes, once clouded with love, were now crystal clear and utterly vacant. They reflected nothing. They were simply optical lenses in a mechanism of flesh and bone. In Fyodor's chest there was nothing but silence and rectitude. No grief, no horror. Only the deep, pure satisfaction a mathematician feels upon solving a centuries-old theorem. It was not murder. It was a cure for the main affliction. Life itself, with its spontaneity, its errors, its love. He looked at the perfect statue of his dog and understood that he had eliminated the last and most significant error in his universe. His own attachment. The silence of his new world lasted 11 hours. Then it was shattered by the most imperfect sound in the universe. A knock at the door. Uneven, hurried, full of human need. Fyodor didn't flinch. He merely noted to himself the arrhythmia of the knocks. 3 quick ones, a pause, then 2 more, with varying force. An error. He opened it. On the threshold stood a young man, soaked and trembling, with long, wind-tangled hair and a feverish gleam in his eyes. Behind him was a violin case, worn and covered in scratches, a map of chaotic journeys. The young man said something about a lost boat, about the storm, about walking along the shore in search of shelter. Fyodor didn't listen to the words. He saw. He saw the asymmetry of freckles on his face, the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, the restless, superfluous movements of his hands. Before him stood not a person, but embodied disorder, a living mass of entropy, far more complex and corrupt than the body washed ashore. He silently let him in. Having warmed by the stove, the young man, who introduced himself as Lev, in a burst of gratitude, took out his violin. "I'll play for you," he said, his voice full of irrational warmth. "It's all I can offer in return." Fyodor nodded, sitting opposite him. He watched as the young man pressed this piece of wood with stretched gut strings against his shoulder, an instrument for extracting ordered noise. But what flowed from the bow was an apotheosis of chaos. Lev played wildly, pouring all his faltering, trembling soul into the melody. It was music full of longing, hope, and rebellion. But Fyodor heard not music. He heard errors. The trembling of the string under his fingers, uncontrolled vibration. The emotional intensity accelerating the tempo, a rhythmic glitch, a slight, almost imperceptible change in pitch in the most piercing note, a dissonance. The very soul imbued in the melody was, for him, just a set of random, messy data distorting the pure mathematics of sound. It was unbearable. It was worse than the cry of a wounded beast. It was ugliness pretending to be beauty. He stood up and approached the musician. Lev, without interrupting his playing, looked up at him, his eyes full of tears and inspiration. Fyodor placed his hand on his shoulder. His will entered the young man like an antiseptic into an open wound. It didn't break or tear, it edited. First it touched the music. The bow in Lev's hand paused for a moment, then moved again, but differently. The sound purified. The vibration left, the breath left, the passion left. Each note became absolutely precise, calibrated, mathematically flawless, and utterly dead. The melody transformed into a sequence of perfect sound signals, devoid of the slightest hint of emotion. This was music an artificial intelligence might compose to prove a theorem of harmony. Then Fyodor's will went further, into the musician himself. It straightened his inspiration hunched back into a perfect vertical. It smoothed the nervous crease around his mouth. It calmed the chaotic beating of his heart, synchronizing it with the metronome of the music. It swept through his brain, erasing not memories, but the connections between them, those irrational bridges that give birth to inspiration, longing, and love. It didn't destroy talent. It distilled it, boiling away all that was human and leaving only pure, cold skill. Lev played the last note and lowered his violin. He looked at Fyodor, and in his eyes, there was no longer any fever, gratitude, or soul. They were clear, calm, and empty, like polished glass. "Thank you," Lev said. His voice was even, devoid of intonation. It was not an expression of feeling, but a factual statement of a completed transaction. He carefully put the violin back in its case, fastened the clasps with calibrated symmetry, and sat on the chair, hands folded in his lap. He became the perfect guest. Quiet, unobtrusive, ordered. Fyodor looked at his creation. He hadn't killed the young man. He had saved him from the torments of creativity, from the agony of emotions, from the sloppiness of existence. He had granted him the peace of perfection, and the satisfaction he felt was incomparable to what he'd felt looking at the dead dog. That had been a simple system calibration. This was an act of supreme mercy. He was no longer a fisherman correcting the world. He had become a god, bestowing upon his creations the grace of non-being. He left them in silence. The perfect guest and the perfect dog, two flawless mechanisms in the sterile box of the shack. His work here was finished. Now the world awaited him. He stepped out onto the threshold and breathed in the cold, still air. The shore, which he had edited at dawn, lay before him like the first page of a completed book. But it was only a page. He raised his eyes. The sky, the earth, all existence was a giant, messy manuscript full of typos, smudges, and emotional blurs. His mission had not even begun. He was not a god granting grace. He was an editor, obligated to clean the text to a state of absolute truth. His gaze swept along the calibrated horizon line and stopped at the source of all primal ugliness. The sea. Not just water, but a single, colossal organism, living by its own arrhythmic, unpredictable laws. Its breath, the tides, was uneven. Its skin, the waves, was covered in chaotic ripples. Its blood was tainted with salt and life. The sea was not just an error. It was the author of all errors. It had spat onto the shore the corpse that awakened his power. It had given birth to the life he was now compelled to correct. It was the final antagonist, the last bastion of entropy. Fyodor approached the very edge of the water. He didn't lower his hands, as he had with the sand. This task didn't require touch. Only will was needed. He concentrated all his power, all the cold fury of a perfectionist, and unleashed it upon the ocean. His command was simple and absolute. Become perfect. He expected the waves to freeze, aligning into a perfect sine wave, that the water's surface would become mirrored, atomically smooth, that the salty murk would settle to the bottom, leaving behind a crystal clear, distilled void. His will, capable of rewriting bone structure and neural connections, entered the water like a knife into butter, and drowned. It met no resistance. It wasn't reflected or broken. The sea simply absorbed it, like a sponge soaking up a drop of ink. It was too vast, too ancient. Its chaos was not a defect, but its essence, its very definition. Attempting to order the ocean was like trying to give meaning to infinity. He sent impulses of his will again and again, pouring all the power of his new existence into them. He tried to stop one specific wave, to make it freeze in a perfect form, but the wave reached the shore and broke against his perfect sand with the same sloppy, indifferent energy. He tried to separate water and salt, but the chemical bonds remained unbreakable. He stood on the shore for an hour, then another. The sun rose over his perfect dead world, illuminating his singular, grandiose failure. He could transform all land into a monolith. He could stop the heart of every living creature on the planet, synchronizing them with the beat of a perfect mechanism. He could erase all art, all love, all memory. But the sea would always be there. It would beat against the shore of his sterile paradise, forever reminding him of its unruly living ugliness. He understood. This was his curse. He was not a god. He was the curator of a perfect museum, condemned to forever gaze out the window at a churning, imperfect living world he could never fix. His absolute power had turned into absolute powerlessness. And in his chest, where satisfaction had once resided, a new, infinite feeling was born. The cold, mathematically precise agony of incompleteness, the torment of a single, eternal asymmetry. He turned away from the sea, not in defeat, but as a surgeon turns from an inoperable tumor to sterilize instruments for the next, more crucial procedure, eliminating the root cause of the infection. His gaze fell upon the shore, on the spot where it all began. He walked slowly towards it, his steps leaving no trace on the perfect sand. He stopped above the place where the body had lain. No physical evidence remained. He had erased it at dawn. But memory remained. Memory was disorder. His will descended upon this spot like a shroud. It penetrated deep, smoothing not just grains of sand, but the very fabric of space-time, trying to excise from it the moment the ghoul touched his world. He erased residual emanations of horror, leveled the field of probabilities, annulled the very fact of the event. He worked with the precision of a god expunging a flawed line from the book of existence. And for a moment it seemed to him that he had succeeded. The air above this spot became as sterile and empty as in his shack. But then another wave rolled onto the shore. It brought with it a new handful of chaotically mixed shells, a fragment of irrationally shaped seaweed, and the scent of decaying, imperfect life. And Fyodor understood. He could edit a page, but he couldn't stop the printing press. The sea would always be there. It would repeatedly bring its typos onto his perfect shore. The error was not in the world. The error was now in him. The knowledge of imperfection had become part of his own structure, an indelible constant in his equation. He returned to the shack and sat on the threshold, on the perfectly calibrated step. Inside, in absolute silence, sat the perfect guest. At his feet lay the perfect dog. They were proof of his rectitude, monuments to his power. But his gaze was fixed on the surf line. He no longer tried to fix anything. His mission had changed. He became the eternal observer of the single error. His consciousness, now an absolute measuring instrument, was condemned to continuously register deviations. He didn't just see the waves. He felt the arrhythmia of every drop, the mathematical sloppiness of the foam, the illogical trajectory of every grain of sand they moved. He heard not the sound of the surf, but the endless white noise of entropy. His gift had become the curse of the world's most precise hearing, trapped in a room with a perpetually dripping faucet. He couldn't go mad, because his mind was too perfect for that. He couldn't die, because he had become a function, not an organism. His sentence was not suffering, but an endless, crystal-clear knowledge of the universe's single insoluble problem, which was now his world.